Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile discussion. Welcome to the patch notes preview for patch 3.25.1. Granny Games have said only that this is going to be launched this week, but it is sometimes the case that they'll post one of these patch notes previews, and then a couple of hours later, before I've even managed to completely edit the video on it, they've ended up setting it live. So it wouldn't surprise me if this is live quicker than they expect, but they've told us to expect it by Friday. In terms of the changes this is including, there's going to be a couple of things that won't have patch notes. We'll come to those in a sec. There's going to be some buffs to the Recombinator, Thaumaturgic dust when used with shipping, and there's going to be some changes to Tier 17 map modifiers. Those are going to be a mixed bag, and we'll come to why that is in a sec. Anyways, let's start with the thing that doesn't make the patch notes preview, and that is that there's likely going to be a fair amount of artwork and other assets that'll be tied to new MTX that Granny Games will put on sale over the next couple of weeks. Basically everything that they've finished all of their internal testing on, that they're intending to release over the next 3 to 4 weeks, will find its way into the 3.25.1 patch. For that reason, this patch might be quite a bit larger than the patch notes will indicate, might be a gigabyte download or something along those lines. We'll find that out once it goes live. As for the MTX themselves, don't have any idea what they're going to be, but it's Granny Games' job to sell those to you, not mine. I am, however, really hoping that we see a Sun Prism version of Eviscerate, partly because I'm playing Eviscerate, but partly because it's a skill that can be used on a number of different builds, and that I think would just look really good with that particular MTX effect. Anyways, that out of the way, let's have a look at the changes to the Settlers mechanics, starting with the Thaumaturgic dust changes. Now, currently the way Thaumaturgic dust works, there is some logarithmic scaling on the amount of Thaumaturgic dust you throw into a shipment. Basically, if you add in 55, 54 Thaumaturgic dust, it pretty much doubles the shipping value no matter what the shipping value is. And if you put in about 8,000 Thaumaturgic dust, it roughly triples the shipping value. However, for the purposes of the rewards that you get back, this shipping value is mostly a high score. The time that it matters is pretty limited, and that is the amount of Kalguuran runes that you get if you're sending to a Kalguuran port, or if you're sending to a Karui port, it's the number of tattoos that you get. This seems to be the only thing it affects. For example, if you send a shipment of wheat with no Thaumaturgic dust out to Kalguur, then with no dust, you might get 50 currency items and 1 rune. And if you throw in a whole bunch of dust, you might instead get 50 currency items and 3 runes. That seems to be what it does at the moment, but it looks like they're going to be overhauling it. Essentially the way it will work in the future, again taking the example of sending a bunch of wheat to Kalguur, if you were sending X amount of wheat and this was going to result in 50 currency items, if you set a certain amount of Thaumaturgic dust, you will instead receive 70% more currency, so 85 currency items. However, the amount of Thaumaturgic dust you need to reach this milestone will be a percentage of the amount of wheat that you sent. The exact numbers are something we'll have to work out over time. So Thaumaturgic dust will be somewhat of a wild card. If you put enough in, it'll be like doubling the amount of other goods you're shipping. If you put enough in, it'll be like tripling the other goods that you're shipping. And this is something that's going to have some interesting impacts on those unique items that disenchant for a lot of Thaumaturgic dust. This is the rare unique items, but the ones that don't have much value in a trade league. A good example here, Tukahama's Fortress. This shield is really, really rare. It's tier 1 rarity, but almost no one's interested in equipping it as an actual equipable item. For that reason, it's something you'd throw into the disenchanter. And guess what you get? You get about 250,000 Thaumaturgic dust for doing so. These sorts of items could be in considerably higher demand as a result of this change, or at least this will be the case if Thaumaturgic dust becomes something that's desirable to ship off in large quantities. We'll have to see if they get the numbers right, but I think that's their goal, is to make it so that you probably want to send a bunch of Thaumaturgic dust, and the more that you are constrained by a particular resource, the more that you're going to send dust alongside that resource when you do send it. For instance, if blue xanthemium is your limiting reagent at the moment, and you're sending off a shipment of 10,000 blue xanthemium, which is cleaning out your stockpiles, that's going to be the sort of thing you're going to want to throw 250,000 Thaumaturgic dust in with. Once we get a chance to play around with this though, we'll be able to do some more strategic thinking on it. The Recombinator is going to be getting buffs, and rarer modifiers have a much higher chance to be selected for the resulting item than before. We're going to have to see what this feels like in practice. The Recombinator has not been very strong so far, although people have found uses for it. We'll need to test this one out a lot because there's just not enough information to say exactly how it's going to work, but I have seen a few things that have been made with the Recombinator that can't be made without it. For example, Grasping Mail exclusive modifiers that have been grafted off onto some of the new armor bases that were added in patch 3.25. It's a very simple change to the Admiral Valerius boss fight, where the portal that spawns is going to be in a much less misclickable space when you first walk in there. One of the most disastrous things you can do is fail a Valerius fight, and the worst way to fail it was to misclick on the portal and to leave without being able to get back in there. That's no longer going to be something that can happen. I really think this fight could do with some mitigation of disconnects though. It's a pretty easy fight to win, but it's something that you can fail by disconnecting once, and that's really disastrous because it'll wipe out one of your ships entirely, wipe out an entire crew of sailors. This is something that's a more severe penalty than failing anything in the game, except maybe the most expensive Uber bosses to attempt, which are Uber Maven and the Uber Eater of Worlds at the moment. And the thing is that one disconnect in the Uber Eater of Worlds, yeah, you lose a portal, but it's not likely to take away all 6. And with the Uber Maven, there's a little bit more chance of failing because of one bad disconnect. But the only way that's going to happen is if the orbs that spawn permanent goo on the ground is currently present. Then in that situation, that could get placed in a really bad spot as a result of disconnect. That might cause you to have more deaths down the line. That's the only way that that's going to happen. All I'm getting at here is that Valerius is extremely unforgiving of disconnects and extremely punishing of them. And I think that that's something that grinding your game should consider trying to find a way to change. I think it's fine to have it so that if you die in the arena, that your crew are down, but I don't think it should necessarily extend to leaving the arena through a disconnect. There's a few things that were missing entirely from the currency exchange. The Blighted Scouting Report, which I had no idea wasn't on the currency exchange. The 6 biome exclusive fossils, so this is Bloodstained, Tangled, Faceted, Glyphic, Fractured, and the other one that I can never remember. And the Uber Boss fragments will all be added to the currency exchange. One thing I'm curious about, the currency exchange currently lists 2 Scarabs that don't exist in the game at all. These are the Scarab of the Commander, which causes you to gain a Kirak mission after completing your current map, and also the Scarab of Evolution, not to be confused with the Domination Scarab of Evolution, which is in the game. The Scarab of Evolution, which causes 10 packs of normal monsters to upgrade to magic. These are not currently obtainable. The currency exchange does list them, and the price that they cost in gold indicates that they are common Scarabs. So I'm curious whether these are going to be added in 3.25.1, or whether the ability to see them on the currency exchange was a complete mistake, and that they will be removed from the currency exchange in 3.25.1. Time will tell on that one. So now we have the tier 17 map modifier changes. These can be broken down into 2 main categories. Firstly, there are a number of numerical nerfs to generally hard mods. These are going to make tier 17s easier. And then at the same time, there is the complete removal of a number of what people term build bricking mods. These are going to make tier 17s harder, because these are free quantity if you're playing a build that doesn't care about them. For example, there is a modifier that reads, players have -2 to the maximum number of summoned totems. This is completely build bricking if you're playing, say, a Hierophant that specializes in spell totems. However, if you're playing pretty much any other build, this does absolutely nothing, but it takes up one of the mod slots on your tier 17 map, and that is now going to be replaced by something else, something that might potentially be harder. Like for instance, the tier 17 exclusive version of the monsters have augmented critical strikes. This is something that's a very dangerous mod, and you might find you roll that instead of -2 maximum summoned totems. All in all, I think this is going to be a bit of a mixed bag for players in terms of the overall changes that are being made. There's a number of map mods that are being unconditionally nerfed though. The Sawblades mod, which was way too hard, this is going to be nerfed down to 3 Sawblades instead of 6, and they're going to move slower. This is still going to be really sketchy unless slowed down is pretty extreme. Mark for Death is going to be changed and mostly nerfed, but not unconditionally nerfed. Players and their minions deal no damage for 4 seconds is being nerfed down to 3 seconds out of every 10. There's still going to be a fairly rude mod, but it's not going to feel quite as nasty. Players have reduced action speed for each time they've used a skill recently is getting a numeric nerf that's considerable. Monsters gain 4 projectiles is being nerfed down to 2. This is still going to be scary if you're scaling map modifier effect, but it's going to be very manageable without that. Monsters have reduced extra damage from critical strikes. This one's going to be a pretty substantial nerf to that mod unless you're scaling map modifier effect, in which case it's still going to be 100% reduced because your map modifier effect is going to push it up that high. And then 2 mods that were completely bricking of wide swathes of builds in conjunction with scaling map modifier effect and pretty rude without it. The less area of effect and less defenses mods, these are going to be nerfed considerably. And the rare monsters and unique monsters drain life on hit is still going to be a very scary mod, but it's not going to be quite as instantly deadly when you come across the wrong type of rare mod. For example, monsters that are added through Eater of Worlds influence, some of those could be really devastating in conjunction with this mod, because draining 10% of your life per hit is very much more dangerous when they're hitting as fast as those things do. The full list of mods that are being removed from the pool, and remember, this means that you can't roll them, but you also can't have them just blocking up a slot on your map. 100% reduced effective curses on monsters, players have -2 maximum number of totems, players in the area take 20% increased damage per nearby ally, so that includes allies in the form of minions, and it includes allies who happen to be other players. Players cannot gain charges, players cannot recharge energy shield, and players cannot regenerate life, mana, or energy shield. Players cannot block and suppress spell damage. 90% reduced effective non-curse auras from skills on you, 80% less recovery of rate of life and energy shield, and monsters cannot be leeched from. Monsters cannot be leeched from, there is going to be a new version of that added, but it's going to be considerably nerfed. Players have 50 to 60% reduced maximum total life, mana, and energy shield recovery per second from leech. What's the overall effect of these? Firstly, I think it's going to mean that corrupted tier 17 maps are going to be easier to beat than they were before, although not many people seem to be corrupting them for fairly good reason, and I don't think that's going to change all that much. Secondly, it's going to in general be easier to roll mods that you can beat by applying Chaos Orbs to maps, so people are going to spend less Chaos Orbs rolling their tier 17s, but the easiest maps that you could roll are going to be harder than they were before this change. Because people will be spending less Chaos Orbs rolling tier 17s, I do think that this could result in the Divine Orb becoming worth more Chaos Orbs. That's not going to be a result of the Divine Orb gaining any buying power, it's going to be the Chaos Orb losing buying power. At least that's my first thoughts on this, but we'll have to see the way that things develop. There is a substantial buff to the Divination Scarab of Plenty. This is now going to cause new packs to be spawned rather than modifying existing packs. This is now going to be good for general juice as well as for targeted divination card farming, and I think this is going to be something that people are going to want to really use. Also, it has a limit of 5 that are allowed to be used per map, which is probably going to be the meta for targeting divination cards on particular maps. There's actually quite a number of divination cards that could be worth targeting with this. Obviously, there's the really rare things like the Apothecary and Fire of Unknown Origin, but also there's divination cards like I See Brothers that are quite a bit more common, although still very rare. And then there's divination cards like the Fortunate, which are much more common again and much more reasonable to see. It'd be really interesting to see how many copies of the Fortunate that you can get per map if you run 5 Divination Scarabs of Plenty, or whether this ends up not being the best use of a fairly uncommon Scarab. Next are some very minor changes. It is already the case that you cannot over-quality a map with special quality. You can only go up to 20% using the Maven's Chisels. The game will now tell you that rather than forcing you to find that out through the bitter experience of failure. Then there's some changes to in-game text on various things, including the names of a couple of Atlas passives. In the bugs section, there's a couple of things that are important. Ransoms will now actually tell you how much the ransom is, which is something that's pretty important to know. Most people, though, will not want to pay the ransom. You'll just want to be able to defeat the boss, because those bosses do drop a fairly large amount of gold when you kill them. Next, there's a bug that was causing some Scarabs to not function in the 6th slot on the map device. This is being fixed, but I'm not sure if it's being fixed for every single Scarab. The Horn Scarab of Awakening, the Scarab of Bisection, they definitely didn't work in the 6th slot, and that was immediately obvious. But as for the other Scarabs that go there, there's a few of them that don't seem to work or that may not work, and that hopefully they'll fix that bug completely. Interestingly, the unique flask Taste of Hate, not only was it nerfed in this patch, but a number of its other mods just stopped working as well. Those other mods are going to work. It's still going to be nerfed, of course, and it's not going to be that popular to use, but if you were using it, then it will actually do what it says it's going to do. And finally, there's a number of fairly small changes here. Anyways, that's patch 3.25.1. It's not live at the time that I'm finishing recording, but who knows, maybe it's live by the time you're watching this. I'm going to leave it there. May your Valorbs have interesting results, and hopefully Grinding Gear Games don't use one on the game servers when they deploy this patch.